What would happen if Africa stopped engaging with the West altogether?
So here is the president of Eritrea basically saying that not just African countries, but countries all around the world are sick and tired of having to play by the West rules. And I think that with the introduction of all of this woke stuff, a lot of countries are just drawing a line in the sand and actually are partnering with Russia.
When the West can no longer exploit, they don't just quietly walk away. They leave with a loud reaction, imposing sanctions and other burdens on Africa. Yet, Africa stands prepared to face that challenge.
Their ideology of not only containing Russia, but containing everyone who doesn't bow to this ideology has been there for the last 30 years. You will be punished if you are not in line with their way of thinking. It's either sanctions, it's either demonizing this or that guy, and using all sorts of tools, including the World Bank, IMF, and other tools they use to pressure everybody to bow to this ideology. And people are fed up of this behavior, this culture of domination, hegemony. Everybody is fed up of it. The people in Africa, above any other continent, would like to see this process going forward and changing their quality of life, not for this generation, but for a...
Recently, Denmark decided to shut down its embassies in Mali and Burkina Faso after these nations refused to continue catering to them. But will the West truly accept this, or will they push back even harder? Let's find out. Denmark is shutting down its embassies in Mali and Burkina Faso, signaling a monumental shift in the dynamics between the West and Africa. If you think this is just a routine diplomatic shuffle, think again. The real story here is how the West, particularly Europe, is grappling with its waning influence on the African continent. Since 2020, Africa has experienced a series of military coups that have sent shockwaves through the Western world. Once seen as a continent dependent on Europe for trade, security, and political direction, Africa is now reasserting its sovereignty, moving away from the West and aligning with new global players like Russia and China. These coups, especially in the Sahel region, have exposed the flaws in the Africa-Europe relationship, showing that African nations are no longer interested in being mere pawns in Western geopolitics. Denmark's decision to close its embassies in Mali and Burkina Faso is a reaction to this changing order. To understand the full scope of this shift, we first need to explore the real reasons behind Denmark's withdrawal and what it signifies in the broader context of Western Africa relations. Why is Denmark leaving Mali and Burkina Faso? Denmark's announcement to shut down its embassies in Mali and Burkina Faso is not just about diplomatic logistics. Their official explanation cites military coups and severely limited scope for action in these countries. But anyone paying attention knows that's only half the story. The real issue lies in the fact that these coups represent a growing trend of African nations rejecting the West's dominance, especially in former French colonies. These nations are charting a new course, one that doesn't rely on the West for validation or support. Let's look at the timeline. In 2020, Mali was the first to experience a coup that reshuffled its government, followed by Burkina Faso in 2022. Both nations have a long history of French colonial influence, and France maintained a strong presence in their military and security operations under the guise of fighting insurgencies. But as these military juntas came to power, one of their first acts was to sever ties with France, shifting their allegiances toward Russia and China. It wasn't long before Niger followed suit, signaling a broader rejection of the West in the Sahel region. Denmark, of course, is not France, but it plays a supporting role in the West's broader strategy in Africa. Denmark's embassies in Mali and Burkina Faso were part of the wider European effort to maintain a foothold in the continent, particularly in areas of military and development aid. Their departure from these nations signals a recognition that the West's influence is crumbling in the face of growing resentment and realignment with non-Western powers. The rise of Russia's Wagner Group in Mali, a private military contractor with direct ties to the Kremlin, has been particularly unsettling for the West. Wagner's presence represents more than just military aid. It is a symbol of Africa's pivot away from Europe and toward new alliances that prioritize sovereignty over subservience. Similarly, China's Belt and Road Initiative (BRI) has gained traction across the continent, offering massive infrastructure investments without the moralizing or political conditions that often accompany Western aid. Denmark's exit from Mali and Burkina Faso is therefore not just a response to internal instability caused by coups. It is a reaction to the reality that Europe is no longer the only game in town for African nations. These countries have options, and they are exercising them, leaving Denmark, and by extension, the West, with fewer seats at the table. But is Denmark the only one leaving? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Denmark is not alone in its diplomatic recalibration. This move is part of a much larger trend where Western powers are rethinking their strategies in Africa. France, the former colonial powerhouse in West Africa, has seen its influence erode dramatically in recent years. In 2022, Mali not only expelled French troops, but also severed diplomatic ties with France altogether. This was followed by Niger, which similarly distanced itself from France, rejecting both military and political ties. Burkina Faso also joined the ranks, moving away from its Western handlers. What we are witnessing is the slow but steady decline of Western hegemony in Africa, particularly in regions that have historically been under Europe's thumb. The West, once confident in its role as Africa's dominant partner, is now scrambling to adapt to a new reality where African nations are asserting their independence and exploring alternative alliances. Even the United States, a latecomer to the game of African influence compared to Europe, has had to adjust its approach. The U.S.'s military presence in the Sahel, primarily through drone operations and military training programs, has also been challenged. Niger recently terminated its military partnership with the U.S., further complicating Washington's involvement in the region. The significance of these shifts cannot be overstated. For decades, the West maintained its influence in Africa through a combination of military partnerships, development aid, and diplomatic presence. But now, African nations are increasingly looking eastward, to Russia, China, and even Turkey and Iran. These nations offer a different type of partnership, one that doesn't come with the same strings attached. Russia, through its Wagner Group, has offered military support without the Western-style nation-building rhetoric. China's BRI has poured billions into infrastructure without the conditionalities of Western aid programs. For African nations, this is a welcome change. The West's paternalistic attitude, offering aid in exchange for adherence to Western political and economic models, has worn thin. The new partners, by contrast, approach Africa with a more pragmatic mindset. They recognize Africa's strategic importance in global geopolitics and are willing to engage without dictating terms. Denmark's departure from Mali and Burkina Faso is part of this broader trend of Western retreat. But make no mistake, this is not a voluntary exit. It is the result of Africa's growing assertiveness and its willingness to explore partnerships that align with its interests rather than those of the West. But as African nations realign their alliances, are they truly benefiting from these new partnerships with Russia, China, and others? Or is this just another form of dependency? The question of whether African nations are better off moving away from Western powers and towards Russia, China, and others is a complex one. On one hand, these new partnerships offer a refreshing alternative to the West's long-standing control over African political and economic systems. On the other hand, there are legitimate concerns that Africa may be trading one form of dependency for another. Let's start with China. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, China has invested heavily in Africa's infrastructure, building roads, railways, ports, and power plants. For many African nations, this has been a game changer. Western aid often comes with strings attached, demands for political reforms, austerity measures, or the adoption of Western-style governance models. China, by contrast, offers no such conditions. Its investments are straightforward: infrastructure for resources. This has allowed African nations to pursue development on their terms without the baggage of Western interference. Russia's role in Africa is different but equally significant. Through military partnerships, particularly in nations like Mali and the Central African Republic, Russia has provided much-needed security assistance in the face of Western reluctance. The Wagner Group, a private Russian military contractor, has been instrumental in helping governments maintain control in regions plagued by insurgency. Unlike Western military aid, which often comes with demands for political concessions, Russia's approach is purely transactional. Military assistance in exchange for political and economic cooperation. For African nations like Mali, which have long been caught in the crossfire of Western counterinsurgencies operations, Russia's approach is a welcome alternative. But is Africa benefiting from these new partnerships? The answer depends on how African leaders manage these relationships. Unlike the West, Russia and China do not impose political conditions on their partnerships, which gives African nations more room to be independent. However, there is still the risk that these partnerships could lead to new forms of dependency, whether through debt or resource extraction. Another important question is, how is the West coping with its loss of influence? The West is not taking Africa's realignment lightly. The closure of Denmark's embassies in Mali and Burkina Faso is a symbolic retreat, but it is far from the end of the West's engagement in Africa. Instead, Western nations are recalibrating their strategies, attempting to regain a foothold in the continent by any means necessary. One of the primary ways the West is responding is through the use of soft power. Realizing that military and political dominance is no longer as effective, Western nations are turning to education, culture, and trade to re-establish their influence. The European Union, for example, has launched new initiatives aimed at fostering people-to-people connections between Europe and Africa. These programs include educational exchanges, cultural diplomacy, and efforts to bring more African students to European universities. This shift in strategy is not just about altruism. The West recognizes that Africa's future, its growing population, its young workforce, and its untapped economic potential will play a critical role in global geopolitics. As such, Western nations are eager to cultivate a new generation of African leaders who are sympathetic to their interests. By bringing African students to study in Europe and the US, the West hopes to maintain its influence through the soft power of cultural ties. In addition to soft power, the West is also increasing its economic engagement with Africa. The European Union has announced plans to increase trade with African nations, offering incentives for African businesses to partner with European companies. This is part of a broader strategy to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, which has given China a significant economic presence on the continent. The West hopes that by offering trade partnerships and investment opportunities, it can compete with China's growing influence. However, these efforts are not without their challenges. Many African nations are wary of returning to the old dynamic where the West calls the shots. The paternalistic approach that has long defined Western relations with Africa, where aid comes with conditions and development, is dictated by Western interests, no longer appeals to African leaders who are asserting their sovereignty. The West's new strategy, while more subtle, still carries the same undertones of influence and control. In the face of these challenges, Western nations are also trying to shore up alliances with countries that are still friendly to their interests. Denmark's decision to open new embassies in Senegal, Tunisia, and Rwanda is part of this strategy. These countries, seen as more stable and aligned with Western interests, are being positioned as hubs for the West's engagement with Africa. By focusing on nations that are still open to Western influence, the West hopes to maintain a presence on the continent, even as other regions pivot toward Russia and China. How does Africa's shift away from the West impact its standing on the global stage? Africa's geopolitical relevance has never been more pronounced. As Western nations like Denmark pull out of key African countries, the message is clear. Africa is no longer the passive recipient of Western policies. The continent is asserting itself, making decisions that prioritize its interests rather than those of external powers. This shift has far-reaching implications, not just for Africa, but for the world. First and foremost, Africa's growing population and economic potential make it a key player in the global economy. By 2050, 1 in every 4 people on the planet will be African, and the continent will have the youngest population in the world. This demographic shift means that Africa will play an increasingly important role in global labor markets, innovation, and consumer demand. Countries that forge strong relationships with African nations today will be well positioned to benefit from this future growth. Africa's natural resources also make it a critical player in global geopolitics. From oil and gas to rare minerals used in technology, Africa's resource wealth is essential to the functioning of the global economy. As countries like China and Russia invest in African infrastructure and secure resource deals, the West is realizing that losing influence in Africa could have serious consequences for its economic security. But beyond economics, Africa's geopolitical significance is also growing. The continent's leaders are increasingly vocal on the world stage, advocating for reforms in global institutions like the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. African nations are pushing for greater representation and a stronger voice in international decision-making bodies, recognizing that their growing influence deserves recognition. At the same time, Africa's shift away from the West presents challenges. The continent must navigate its relationships with emerging powers carefully, ensuring that it does not fall into the same traps of dependency that defined its past relations with Europe. African leaders must ensure that partnerships with countries like China and Russia are truly beneficial for their people, rather than serving the interests of external powers. The world is waking up to the reality that Africa is the future. To sum this up, Denmark's exit from Mali and Burkina Faso is just one small part of a larger geopolitical shift that is reshaping the continent's role in global affairs. As Africa distances itself from the West and builds new alliances, it is asserting its sovereignty and taking control of its destiny. The days of Africa being a passive player in global geopolitics are over. The continent is now a key player on the world stage, and its influence will only continue to grow. The future is African, and the world gets better. Do you think any African nation should welcome the Denmark embassy? What would happen if no one let them? Let us know in the comments section. When Africa will be West-free. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.